Well, I want to say good morning to everyone.
Good morning.
I hope your morning is going well. Mine is going well, and I'm very grateful for seeing another day. So we're here to celebrate UTSI's annual Black History Month, and we are so excited for the program that we have outlined today. This is our 29th year. Y'all may be seated. This is our 29th year of the celebration, so we want you to enjoy our program, get ready for our speaker, get ready to see some entertainment, so just get ready, get ready, get ready. We are excited. Okay, we're going to follow the program as it is printed. I've welcomed you. You are very welcome. If I didn't use those exact words, you are welcome to UTSI. On behalf of our executive director, which you will hear from in a little while, you are very welcome to UTSI. Let's pause for a moment of silence. Thank you. Okay, our program will go as printed. We'll have a selection, Lift Every Voice and Sing. You guys give me a second to get to the piano. And then we're going to have a selection following that by Miss Ashley Brooks. And then we'll be back with remarks and introduction of a speaker by our executive director, Dr. John Smisher, and our speaker, Colonel Randel Gordon, in that order.
Here's your friendly announcer. place that loves in need of love today. Don't delay, send yours in right away. Hate's going round, breaking many hearts. Stop it, please, before it's gone too far. The force of evil plans could make you its possession, and it will if we let it destroy everybody. We all must take precautionary measure. If love and peace you treasure, then you'll hear me when I say, oh, that love's in need of love today. Don't delay, send yours in right away. Oh, love's in need of love today. Stop it, please, before it's gone too far. Don't you hear me? That love's in need of love today. Don't delay, send yours in right away. Hate's going round, breaking many hearts. Stop it, please, before it's gone too far. Don't you hear me? That love's in need. Yeah. Don't you hear me? Love's in need. Yeah. L-O-V, love's in need.
Good morning. So glad y'all could join us today for our joint Black History Month celebration. I believe that we've got a lot of folks from ADC today, and if you haven't figured it out yet, we're incredibly blessed to have Colonel Gordon as our speaker. I believe we are a combined event, and I'm so delighted to have that happen and to welcome not only our friends from ADC, but also colleagues from the university, or other places in the community. I see Motlow, I see friends from Tullahoma, I'm sure there's some folks from Manchester here. Thank you all so much for being here today. Now, I'm John Schmischer, and I have the real pleasure of being Executive Director of the Space Institute and to be in a position to be up here and to welcome everyone today and to celebrate some of the great talent we heard on the stage this morning. And let's give them a round of applause one more time. We're very blessed there. So I was chatting with Patricia this morning. She said, you got your remarks prepared. I said, I'm a professor. I only speak in increments of 50 and 75 minutes. And she looked at me and she said, John, you were standing between all those people and a fantastic speaker and a great meal, so you'd better keep it brief. And I'm going to do that today, ma'am. But let me ask y'all, how many of you know someone who can fly more than 70 different types of airplanes? Show of hands. I got 1, 2, 3, okay? How many of y'all know somebody who's graduated from Harvard Business School? I assume you military guys can hold your hands up. Again, they're kind of in the know on this, right? Okay? But think about it. How many people do you come across in your lifetime that have that type of credentials? If you actually, I won't go through Colonel Gordon's list of incredible accomplishments here, except to say, man, I'd better go work on catching up a little bit. We are very fortunate to have a highly accomplished person speaking with us today. But he also exhibits a life of service. If I do my calculation right, this is 30 years of service to, and I figured you went to the academy, so I tacked 4 on the back end, right? So, Colonel Gordon's probably in his 30th year of a life of service to our country, and now in a position of leadership in that area. Now, I don't know that he's going to remember this. I don't think he did, but I saw Lieutenant Colonel Gordon speak at a meeting in Florida when he came to the AFOSR test and evaluation meeting to talk about some work that he was doing at AFWorks. And I remember sitting in the back of the room going, wow, this guy is really sharp and he's really motivating people around this. I think, fast forward a few years, we're here in Tullahoma, and we heard that Colonel Gordon's coming to be the director of ADC. And the first reaction I get from everybody else is, wow, what an incredible sharp guy. He motivates people to want to do things with the energy and the charisma that he brings to any type of interaction. Okay, so he's a motivator. And finally, the thing that I think really made a profound impact on me was we had Snowmageddon a few weeks ago, or blizzards, or whatever it was, that was pretty rough. Every day before the announcement went out, Colonel Gordon would give me a call in the middle of the afternoon and say, hey, I just want you to know what we're doing, working with our local partners, and here's our plans for tomorrow, so we could coordinate around that. And I would often wait to announce what we were going to do at UTSI until I had heard from the base. Okay, so let's summarize. We've got someone who's incredibly accomplished, has had a life of service to others, is incredibly inspirational to other people and can motivate you to want to go and do things, and he really cares about a lot of other people. I cannot fathom having a better speaker and someone more qualified to speak to us today as our guest speaker. And with that, I'd like to introduce Colonel Randel Gordon and thank him so much for being our speaker.
I'll have to pay you some money later. But,
No, it's easy when you have good
that was
material.
fantastic. Well, good morning, everyone. Everyone hear me all right? Okay, everything's good on the sound levels up there? I'm mic'd up with like 20 different microphones here, so if I fall over, it's easy. Hey, happy Valentine's Day, everyone. Right? Can't forget that. So, please, 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 make sure you take a little bit of extra time to, say hi to the person that you love in your life today, right? Otherwise, you'll get in trouble. So you don't want to have that bad. All right, good. Also, I want to thank UTSI. Thank you for inviting me out here. They gave me an interesting challenge, which is they said, I want you to talk about something Black History Month, but also tie it to the arts. But we're also, because we're UTSI, it's got to be engineering nerd stuff as well. So I'm like, okay, how do you combine arts, engineering, nerds? I was like, okay, I think I have an idea, so we'll see how this goes. I want to tell you a little bit about the story of one of my personal heroes in my life. Probably have never heard about him, but this is by his own admission, a man who was famous for the thing that never happened in his life. And this is the story of Ed Dwight, Air Force test pilot out of Edwards Air Force Base, that had an extraordinary story that I think is probably appropriate for today. So let me take you a little bit through his story, because this inspires me, and hopefully it does the same thing for you as well. So let's see if everything works here, by the way. So I'm going to take you back a little bit of time here. So this is back to the 1950s, 1960s. The big events that were happening at that time, obviously, were the Civil Rights Movement and the Cold War. This is a story that kind of fuses the two of those together. When I think back on the Cold War and when I think back on the Civil Rights Movement, I've been to Montgomery, Alabama a couple of different times in my life, and it was kind of really humbling to walk around and see all these different places that I've read about in textbooks, but then you actually get a chance to actually stand there in that position and go, wow, you feel the gravity, the weight of the moment. So a lot of the narratives of the Civil Rights Movement were some of the things that we see here. Obviously, a lot of this happened in Alabama, one of the central spots, if you will, of the Civil Rights Movement. But then there's also this other narrative that happened kind of in what I would view is there were two ways with which to kind of fight for racial justice. One was through the protests that we saw through Martin Luther King's and everything that everyone here is familiar with. The other way that I've seen that fought very, very well is to just be ridiculously excellent at whatever it is that you were. And so I think of Sidney Poitier, Thurmond, Jackie Robinson, all of these great legends, if you will, that when I look at them, I go, they combated the stereotypes by just being fantastically good at whatever it is that they did. And so I've always kind of tried to balance what's the best way with which to try to stand up and to represent. And I've kind of taken this path that was taken by all these legends and these greats. And that's a little bit of the story of Ed Dwight as well. So let me kind of put you where we were. Everyone's seen The Right Stuff, right? I'm assuming in this crowd, people kind of know that movie. Tom Wolfe, kind of a legend of Edwards Air Force Base and the Mercury 7 astronauts when they were first selected. The idea, now it's kind of commonplace for us now, but the idea that the United States would have technological superiority over the Soviet Union, back in the 1950s, that was not a foregone conclusion. We had a little bit of superiority, if you bit, up until the Soviets detonated their own atomic weapon. And then at that point, things really kind of took off. And the Sputnik moment, that's a term that we still use today, which is to say that there was technological surprise from a place we didn't expect it. That really caught a lot of folks' attention, and that kicked off the dawn of what we now call the space age, and led to things like AEDC and UTSI and everything that we're kind of familiar with for today. At the time, there was a big question mark over, well, if we're going to select our first astronauts, what type of background do they need to be? And there were some thoughts of, hey, let's go find deep sea divers, let's go find acrobats, let's go find race car drivers. And ultimately, the question was put forth to President Eisenhower, himself a prior military man, probably the prior military man, as General Dwight Eisenhower. And in his mind, there was only one correct answer, and that was, I want military test pilots. Because in his mind, more so than just having all of the skills to operate in various different stressful environments, he was also concerned about the ability to follow orders and to be very disciplined about what they were going to go do. And so that decision from President Eisenhower kind of set in force a series of different things and kind of made up the makeup of what you see in our first group of astronauts, the Mercury 7. All more or less came from the Midwest, all white male, fighter background, different types of, either Navy, Marine, or U.S. Air Force at the time. But that decision from President Eisenhower made it such that you didn't see minorities, you didn't see women. That was still some time further out. And the man to the right there, you might recognize him, that's Edward R. Murrow, right? A man deeply, deeply connected with a lot of the political leadership at the time. And he saw this. And again, I'm trying to put everyone in the context of the Cold War and about this period of time. And he looked and he said, we are the United States of America. And we tout, right, in our founding documents that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And these are the values that we want to export to the world because we're in this existential crisis with the Soviet Union. And again, even though we know how that ended, at the time, the idea of whether or not the Soviet Union would outclass the United States was still very, very much in question. And so in Edward Murrow's mind, he was thinking, the space program is going to be one of the most visible things that we project to the world. And if we project to the world something different than what we say we stand for, the adversary at that point, the Soviet Union, will absolutely pick up on that. And they will exploit that against us. And so he wrote a letter directly to Vice President Lyndon Johnson at the time stating, hey, we need to go find, he quotes, non-white member to form the astronaut corps, because if we don't do that, right, this is beyond just, hey, let's go find anyone. Clearly we got to go find someone qualified for that, but if we don't act the way that we say that we are trying to be, again, there will be that dissonance, and again, that will diminish the brand of the United States and democracy and freedom in the world. And here's what Murrow is getting at. So this is the world circa 1959. And if it's blue or deep red, those parts on the chessboard, that was already pretty well set. You're either with the United States alliance, NATO, or you're with the Soviet Warsaw Pact. Everything else was still up for grabs. read there, read there. And when you look at the histories and the documents of domino theory, and this kind of gets into a little bit of why we were so engaged in Vietnam, because there was concern that if communism takes hold there, that it will just trigger off this cascade of dominoes that will have no ending, and eventually the Soviet Union will dominate the world. Now, again, is that paranoia? Well, we tend to say the same things today with respect to China and their expansion of global influence around the world, and we kind of say, hey, we feel a bit uncomfortable with the fact that China has inroads into places like Africa and whatnot. So were the folks in the 1950s all that different than what we are today? I don't think so. I think they were thinking very much in the same way of, we want this entire world to be dark blue because I can't let them, expand into all these different spots. Guess where these countries, again, predominantly non-white. So Murrow kind of had this idea, and so that went to Vice President Johnson, and then that eventually made it to the Kennedy administration. Also particularly Bobby Kennedy, President Kennedy's brother. And so the call went out to, let's go look for a non-white, quote unquote, that would meet the qualifications for what it means to be an astronaut in the United States. Incidentally, the Soviet Union absolutely capitalized on this. They had the first man in Yuri Gagarin. They had the first woman in Valentina Tereshkova. And they also, which is widely unknown, they had the first non-white in Colonel Mendez, who was, his nationality was Cuba, but ethnically from Africa. So they flew with Vostok, and Soyuz was where Colonel Mendez flew. And from the Soviet Union perspective, and you read this in a lot of their histories as well, the Soviet Union was very much in the world of, hey, we called each other comrade. And especially to, again, if you go back one slide, a lot of these countries were prior colonies of the British or the French. And so the experience they had was their countries, their natural resources, their human resources, their people were exploited by colonial powers somewhere else. And so this notion that the Soviet Union was putting forward of, hey, we are all comrades, and we believe in an equitable society, and we elevate, when they saw that made a big difference in their minds in terms of which way do I go? Do I ally with the United States and NATO and maybe perpetuate this standard kind of colonial doctrine that I've lived under for so long? Or as we go through our own independence movement, do I side more with the Soviet Union because they're actually showing, what they're actually preaching, Vice what the United States was showing, which was our Mercury 7 astronauts, which basically all looked like the exact same demographic. All right. Enter Ed Dwight, who I think, when you hear a little bit of his story, so he's from Kansas City. I'd have to imagine he is still a Kansas City Chiefs fan. He's still alive, by the way. So I imagine he was pretty happy over the last weekend. Unlike me, where my Buffalo Bills were way out and gone. But Ed Dwight grew up in Kansas City. His father played in the Negro Leagues in Kansas City at the time. Ed Dwight had kind of that typical kind of Midwestern grown-up kind of experience, was active in the church, had a paper route. And a lot like me, he grew up not that far from a local airfield, and he would go down there, and he was just completely fascinated with airplanes. Loved just hanging around airplanes. He would help fix them. He would help clean them. And then eventually, after doing that for a little bit of time, he got up the courage to ask for a flight. And then when you read a little bit of Ed's kind of story, you come to find that he describes it as the moment the airplane broke ground and he could climb up above and he could see the horizon. In his mind, he felt that he was as free as a bird, his words. And especially, again, if you're growing up in the 1930s, 1940s, in Kansas City area, when he got airborne, he viewed it as, hey, there's no racial boundaries here. I'm not restricted. I can fly where I need to. And he just completely fell in love with the notion of aviation, and it never left his side. I told you he had a paper route, and one day as he's delivering a paper, this was about early 1950s time frame, there was a picture, because he had two routes. He had the papers that he would deliver to the white residences at the time, and then he had the paper that he would deliver to the black residents of Kansas City at the time. On the paper for the black residents, there was a picture of a fighter pilot that was shot down in Korea and was a prisoner of war and happened to be a black man. And that was the first time Ed had ever seen a black man fly a fighter jet. And in his mind, he says, wow, they're letting Negroes fly. I know exactly what I want to go do. And so he went down to the recruiter, signed up for the U.S. Air Force, went through what we would now call officer training school, and eventually got assigned to fly fighter jets, just like what you saw in that picture. So here he is, and one of my favorite kind of airplanes, it's just kind of awesome. He's just looking pretty cool. That's just neat stuff there. So now I take you back to Edward Murrow, when he was writing President Kennedy and Vice President Johnson, the call went out to, hey, I need to find a black officer above the rank of second lieutenant that happens to be a pilot and also has the right engineering background. Just so happens Ed, by this point, had achieved an engineering degree from Arizona State University. And so when they did the demographic poll, you can imagine he's the only one that showed up. So he had an interesting kind of thing, because for folks like me, and there are a couple other test pilot school graduates here, we all had to apply to test pilot school, right, and go through the process to get selected into there. Ed received a message directly from the Kennedy administration saying, you are going to test pilot school at Edwards Air Force Base because we are going to make sure that you are trained to become our nation's first black astronaut. Whoa, right? So he gets this message, Ed Dwight, captain at the time, and he goes and he talks to his commander about it. And his commander actually told him, hey, I wouldn't do that if I were you. And it had nothing to do with anything racial. It had everything to do with the fact that, again, at the time, astronauts were, quote unquote, spamming a can. His commander told him, hey, you got a good career going here. We all love you. You're going to be a general one day, Ed, so why don't you stick with us? This pathway is pretty well lined up. We love you here. But the moment you go do this astronaut thing, I don't know what that's going to be about. So Ed received that feedback, thought about it, and then in his words, he says, well, my curiosity got the best of me, and at the same time, I'm getting all these calls from the White House. I think I ought to honor that. And so he raises his hand and says, I'm going to go to test pilot school. So then he ends up there. Here's Ed, and I love this picture of him because in addition to being arguably, I think, our first African American that went to test pilot school, he's arguably our shortest one that ever went. He is 5'4", right, which is impressive. So he had a number of things to go through there. But Ed was a fighter pilot. He got qualified on what I think is one of the coolest airplanes that ever existed, the F-104 Starfighter. I think they called it the missile with a man in it or something like that. And the way the airplane was built, it had a heavy engine and it had a heavy cockpit, and when it had the wingtips filled with gas, so it had barbells effectively. So barbell on the wingtips, because of the fuels, and then barbells on either side of that airplane. So it had a very, very vicious stall, and it had a very, very vicious roll coupling moment, the thing, once it would depart controlled flight. So it was not an easy airplane to fly. But one of my favorite scenes from The Right Stuff was the infamous scene where Chuck Yeager steals, quote unquote, the F-104. Now, a lot of that is kind of Hollywoodism. However, the video of that airplane flying off of Edwards Air Force Base is 100% real, and it is in all its glory. It is a fantastically beautiful airplane. So Ed had this interesting journey at the test pilot school, because at that time, there was a brief period of time where the test pilot school was actively training Air Force officers to be astronauts in a military astronaut program. A lot of folks don't know this, but the Gemini program, everyone saw the public view of Gemini. There was also a military version of the Gemini program that was just going to be for the United States Air Force, solely to put airmen on board a Air Force space station via an Air Force Gemini capsule to be able to perform surveillance missions of the Soviet Union. So it was a highly classified fact at the time. Now it's a matter of public record. But there were two programs. One was the Gemini program, the military version of the Gemini program, and then the other one was what's called Dinosaur, which is the X-20, which was a lifting body vehicle that was going to, basically be a very, very high-speed, hypersonic vehicle that was going to skip glide over top of the atmosphere and could deliver payloads, shall we say, to targets around the world. And that was going to be operated by United States Air Force people. Both programs imploded. They never really got much beyond the design stage. But at the time, that was a very serious thing, and to be able to find the first cadre of folks to go do that, that's what the Air Force Test Pilot School was for. And so that's the program that Ed Dwight got recruited in to be, which was, hey, we're training military astronauts. And oh, by the way, if we're going to go through the process of training military astronauts, we're also going to submit their packages to NASA so that they can get accepted into the next batch of astronauts. And so Ed was kind of in that group of folks, and he had an interesting kind of play of it. He would go to test pilot school, and for all of us that have been through test pilot school, you know how rigorous that actually really is. But then, at the time, you could actually take airplanes on the weekends to go visit other different spots in the country, and he would have a lot of speaking engagements because, again, he was, quote-unquote, Kennedy's boy, who had been appointed by the White House to be our first astronaut, black astronaut. And so he had a couple of different duties. There was a public affairs duty that he had, but then he also had the duty to complete the test pilot school as well. And that was just a lot to put on any one individual. Here is, let me see if I can get this to work on the next one. There we go. The man to your right, that is Colonel Chuck Yeager. At the time, the commandant of the Air Force Test Pilot School. And that's Ed Dwight obviously sitting to the side. They're both talking about the F-104. I guarantee you, this picture was staged. Because these two people did not like one another at all. From Chuck Yeager's perspective, again, you read his biographies, and from his perspective, he says, hey, the White House foisted this man up on us, and we didn't want him because we don't think he's qualified, but we felt as though we had to kind of, play along because of all the horsepower that was behind him. From Ed Dwight's standpoint, he says, hey, when I got accepted to test pilot school, Colonel Chuck Yeager pulled everyone into the auditorium and effectively said, we're going to get this man out, right? So no one speak to him, no one engage with him, and in 6 months that will psychologically break him, and then he will be gone, right? Hard to say which one of those is 100% true. I just know as a fact that the relationship between these two individuals was terrible. They really didn't like one another, and from Ed's standpoint, that was just an additional stressor that was sitting on top of him. But again, he looked at it and said, I work for the White House, right? That's where my political support comes from, and I've been given this great mission that I want to actually go do this. And so he did everything he possibly could to kind of let that go by the wayside and just do everything he could to keep his head down and get through the course at test pilot school and go graduate. On the day that he was actually officially announced as, hey, this is our nation's first black astronaut, and we're training him for the astronaut program. He'll either be on the military side or he's going to go off to NASA. This was the picture taken at Edwards Air Force Base of Ed and his family all put together. And just what a joyous moment that was for him, big deal. And he was saying he was getting, this is Ed's words, he was getting 1,500 letters a day from folks across the country that just wanted to speak to him, to talk to him. Ed ended up on the cover of a number of different magazines at the time. This was Jet Magazine and Sepia, another magazine, looking super heroic in his cool flight suit, kind of standing there looking cool and sharp and strapped. It was a big deal, right? It was a big deal. And again, I told you, by the week, right, he was a test pilot school student. On the weekends, he was traveling around to a lot of different spots and venues to be able to tell the story. Because again, in the mind of the Kennedy administration, there was a way to project American ideals and also a way with which to try to heal the country from a lot of civil rights issues that were happening. And that all focused, if you will, through Ed, right? So there was a lot going on here to be able to make this actually happen. This is the dinosaur program. That's the model that he's holding. Atlas booster that was sitting back behind her. Again, talking about what he was going to go do. Now, eventually, right, I told you he had a really bad relationship with Chuck Yeager. Chuck Yeager didn't like him. He didn't like Chuck Yeager. But at the end of the day, Ed did graduate the Air Force Test Pilot School. He was in the training pipeline for the military astronaut program. And on his, what we would now call a training report, Chuck Yeager put some words to the effect of, well, he stuck to it, he, hung in there and put his nose to the grindstone, and he graduated and, yay verily and go forward. However, that rift never healed, right? In later years, Chuck Yeager still contended, hey, we weren't behind this program, we didn't think he belonged there, had nothing to do with his race, I got branded as a racist, but all these other things, right, were the reasons why we didn't support this, right? Ed, for his point, knew that if he, quote unquote, played the race card, that it would come across as whining, and he didn't have time for that. And so he just accepted the fact and moved on with his life to be able to just kind of, again, excellence, right? Be very excellent at what you do to be able to fight through a lot of that. So here's the story and how it went. So Gemini program, so we all know the Mercury 7. The second group of astronauts was Gemini program. Ed submitted a package into that astronaut selection process, got very, very far into it, but ultimately was not selected in that second group of astronauts. When they rolled out that second group of astronauts, Deke Slayton, who was the head of the astronaut office at the time, he got a very pointed question of, hey, wasn't there a Negro that was supposed to be on stage? And in the press conference, he basically kind of puts it to bed and says, no, there was not. Next question, and moves on beyond that. So NASA never fully divulged, they don't do this as a matter of course even today, but they never fully divulged why Ed was not selected other than to say he didn't make it. And then what happened after that is Kennedy was assassinated just a few months after the Gemini astronauts were announced. And Ed, at that time, was training up at what we now call Boeing Seattle, because they were doing a lot of stuff for the military astronaut programs. And so he was training there. He was in the middle of a flight simulation training event there. They walked in and said, hey, training's over. The president's just been assassinated. And Ed, from his standpoint, says his heart went to his ankles because he knew, one, he loved President Kennedy, but then he also knew what that meant for him in his personal life, that he had lost all his political top cover and his support from that. So he had intentions of applying to the next batch, right, in 1965, to be able to apply for the astronaut program then, but by that point, he had lost out on all of his political support. By the time he got back to Edwards, he was kind of shuffled around to meaningless, nothing kind of jobs. And then eventually in 1966, Ed decides that he's going to resign from the US Air Force. And for the folks that have been to Edwards Air Force Base, I've been stationed there 3 times in my life, you know those roads that lead out to the gates are very long. And you know, when you read Ed's biography, he talks, I loaded up my Volkswagen in base housing, and I put all my belongings in there, and I drove out the gate, and even to this day, right, this is something that's still a very emotional event for Ed, because he feels, and I understand what he's talking about, that he was rug pulled by the US Air Force, never fully supported. He feels as though he lost his political top cover from the White House. And then if you go back to some of the pictures that we were talking about before, especially at that time frame, being a minority, being a fighter pilot, having an engineering degree, being told, right, and broadcast to the world that you were going to be America's first black astronaut, to realize that that was not going to happen for him was devastating. And so he describes driving out that long road, which is sort of similar to Wattendorf, right? Just very, very long, you know, straight for a while, and driving out the gate and just feeling completely and totally defeated in life. And I totally understand what he was getting at. You can all imagine that, just given everything that was on his shoulders at the time. So, what is one to do with that, right? Ed, he says, in 1969, when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, probably Ed was the only one that had no idea what he was doing at that particular moment, wasn't even paying attention, didn't watch, not because he didn't care, because it was too painful. It's too painful, right? Because he viewed, hey, I could have been there, I could have done that, and I just wasn't given that up, it was taken from me, right, is what the way Ed described it. Ed goes into this interesting Forrest Gump kind of world where after he leaves the Air Force, he joins IBM, becomes an engineer for them, moves to Colorado. He does that for a little bit, decides he wants to open up restaurants, and so he does that for a little bit. Then he decides, hey, I want to go start a flight department, and so he flies for a little bit and does that. And then right around 1975, 1976 timeframe or so, he realizes that the thing he really, really loves and he's got some talent in is art. And so he becomes a sculptor, and this is Ed now, in his studio, by the way, an old converted hangar in Denver, where he goes into sculpture, gets a Master's of Fine Arts from the University of Denver, and goes into probably a second passion. In other words, all of that pain, right, all that humiliation, that shame, that anger, he harnesses that and he funnels it into something that he thinks he can still contribute to the world. And in a certain sense, his backstory of who he was and what he was, that actually provides character to his artwork now. So none of us in this room can afford any of Ed's works now because they are all public domain kind of things. These are some of the things that Ed has produced. So his big thing is important works that have to do with African American history. So one of his favorite things is about musicians. So Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald. He's been commissioned to produce public works to be able to describe a little bit of their stories. Obviously, he's been commissioned to perform for Martin Luther King and Coretta King, and then also this is a statue that sits on the grounds of the Capitol in Austin, Texas, that describes the role that African Americans played in opening up the frontier, right, the West, and he was trying to tell that story. So he only does public works, and then if you wanted to be able to purchase some of his private works, they go for several $100,000 a piece. And so it's a pretty amazing story that goes on from there. So, what are we to kind of make of all of that? To me personally, right, these are kind of the lessons I take from Ed's story. One is just a remarkable, remarkable story of resilience, a remarkable story of excellence, because in all of those different categories, be it engineer, be it pilot, be it sculptor, he still rose to the top of his ranks and preserved a level of tremendous dignity amongst a lot of different pressures that were happening for him. So I take that, right, personally, to me, right, what that kind of means. Second thing I pull from it, and you'll see this now, incidentally, if you wanted to hear more of Ed's story, National Geographic Channel this week is posting a series of stories they call the Space Race, which talks about African Americans in the space program. And what's really heartening when you watch that story is you get to hear stories from guys like Leland Melvin, guys like Charlie Bolden, who became the administrator for NASA. They all point to Ed Dwight as the person that they credit for the fact that they were able to go and become astronauts and fly in space. So he's still very much, right, even in his sculptor capacity sitting in Denver, he's kind of considered like the godfather, if you will, of the black astronaut program in the United States. Incidentally, even long after Ed's story, it wasn't until 1983, I think, with the space shuttle program, where Guy Buford became the first African American astronaut to go do. That was 20 years, 2 decades. After the whole story with Ed Dwight, but same thing, Guy Buford kind of points back and says, well, I couldn't be here if it weren't for Ed. So the second aspect I kind of pull from Ed's story is just the notion of being first and having the courage to do that. To me, when I think what is the story of Black History Month or African American stories, I kind of view it as making a way where there is no way before. And that's kind of the legacy that I view, where guys like Ed Dwight did that for the astronaut program, such that you could then have the astronaut corps that you see today. So it's a pretty remarkable story. So in his words, again, he says this kind of half jokingly, but he is most famous for the thing that didn't happen, which is that he didn't become our nation's first African American astronaut. But in the process of doing that, he became, at least to me, right, and a lot of folks, I think just a remarkable model of just dignity and excellence, of how do you showcase who you are. Someone told me once that you don't become a great person when things are going well in your life. It's when everything is falling apart and the chips are down, that's when your greatness comes out, right? And Ed absolutely demonstrated that. So, that's his story. That gives me a lot of excitement, a lot of inspiration, and a lot of hope. He is still alive. He's in his early 90s now in Denver. I had this dream one day of actually walking up to his studio and, hey Ed, I'm Laz. You were an inspiration to me. Good to see you. Hey, by the way, can I have one of your pieces of artwork? And also, if there's a campaign to get someone to fly on Blue Origin, New Shepard capsule, I think if you fly William Shatner and Strahan and whatever else and all those other guys, fly Ed, right? He certainly earned it, right? Let him get a capsule flight. I think that would be a great way to kind of close the loop and end the story the way that I think that should have ended back in the 1960s. So, I'll open it up for questions. Any thoughts or inputs along the way? Incidentally, just a show of hands, how many had heard Ed's story? Couple? Don't feel weird about that. I didn't know that for the longest time either, right? It just kind of got buried in history. And then you start uncovering this and you realize, oh my God, right? There's a lot of really amazing things that happened there that America just forgot, right? So, really, really amazing story. Like I said, if you've got the time, look at that National Geographic special. It's really cool, right? You get a chance to hear him in his own words really describe what that was all about.
Sir, a quick question.
Yeah.
How did you come across that story?
So the question was, how did I come across Ed's story? A little bit of a roundabout way. So I was at Edwards Air Force Base as a test pilot. This was like 2000, by about 2012, 2013 timeframe. And there's a memorial, there's a plaque there that talks about, folks in the previous astronaut program kind of thing. There was a successor after him that was in an F-104 flying approach to the runway and had an issue and had to eject out of the airplane. And his front seater survived. He was the back seater. He was killed in the ejection. But there's a little story in a plaque that kind of talks about that. And then I started talking to the historian there, and he told me that story, but then also said, hey, did you ever hear the story of Ed Dwight? And I was like, I've never heard that, and kind of showed me a little bit of all that was there. And I think, wow, here I am at Edwards Air Force Base. I'm walking the same piece of ground that Ed did. I'm flying in the same airspace that Ed did. And I had no idea, right, as an African-American myself and a test pilot, that Ed ever existed. And oh, by the way, he's still alive, right? Isn't that cool? So that was my first introduction to it, was the historian office at Edwards Air Force Base, right? Hearing a little bit more story about a crash that occurred, but then going, oh my God, wow, never knew about Ed, right? It's a pretty amazing story. What else? All right. Well, hey, I'll be available if you want to chat a little bit offline, and happy to start for the next event.
Let's applaud him one more time. Beautiful, beautiful presentation. Go ahead.
Okay. So we want to thank Colonel Gordon for being here today. And I was handed a wood box. I'm not quite sure what's in it. But,
Is it ticking or something? It is ticking. It's like, whoa.
For the record, I have, prior to moving to academia, I was fortunate to have 23 years with the Air Force. And I think they do it something like this.
Yeah.
So, let me go ahead and read the inscription. It says, University of Tennessee Space Institute, to Colonel Randel J. Gordon, Commander, thank you for presenting at the 29th Annual Black History Celebration, February 14th, 2014. And we hope, Colonel Gordon, will leave this with a lot of mementos to remember what a fantastic service you provided to us today. We're an educational institute, and I learned a lot today. And I imagine a lot of us in this room did as well. I would encourage everyone to keep learning about our nation's history and to look at the great role models and examples. So thank you for your leadership in helping us get where we need to go. So thank you again one more time for all you do.
Enjoy that. Please enjoy that.
Now, Patricia, please.
Okay. We have some more goodies for him, so HR office is gonna have a bag. Somebody's coming from the side. Okay, so this concludes our program. I want to thank some folks before we exit the stage. Special appreciation to our guest speaker, Colonel Gordon, our UTSI Executive Director, Dr. John Smisher, Shannon Burks for helping. Shannon and Ashley both led us into Lift Every Voice and Sing. And that rendition by Ashley Brooks, we thank her for that. We thank Laura Horton, Megan Morris, Budget and Finance, Dining Hall Facilities, Yeah, hey to the Human Resources Office. Information Technology and the UTSI family AEDC personnel, specifically Lee Smith, I know he's here, Director of Integrated Prevention and Response, and Rachel March, Operations Chief, AEDC Public Affairs. And we thank all of you for coming out and supporting this program today. This is very important. And before we go, because I'm standing in between you and refreshments, we want to say Happy Valentine's Day to everyone in the room. Have a wonderful day and enjoy the reception. Thank you again.